Don't be too hard on yourselves, right? Get your expectations right. If you had a bunch of philosophy students on the postgrad level, such as yourselves or junior lecturers, going through Ronchamp or going through Zumthor's museum, they would also be scratching their heads and feeling a little bit at a loss and saying, well, there's something here that I'm missing, etc., etc. So remember that we are dealing with some of the most revered, established philosophers coming at a debate that is in some cases as old as the European Enlightenment itself, so 300 years of serious issues underlying these things. Don't expect to sort of feel comfortable and get it. And also, if these things were resolved for once and for all, we wouldn't have this kind of discipline. We wouldn't have philosophy where everything is open to being contested, to being questioned, and to being revised and rethought. So everything is really up for grabs. If you find something a useful tool for your thinking or for your work, then use it as a tool. These things are instruments, they are tools. And for some things a screwdriver is good, and for some things a pliers is good, and whatever. And don't bother yourself too much about the other tools in between which don't talk to you and which you don't need. So be very brutal about it. Be like carnivorous animals and just take the piece you need to feed on and use it, because after all, many of you are facing this problem of formulating a thesis topic and so on, and needing to know that you have the right kind of backup and stuff to pursue an argument. And all of you will have to pursue these inquiries in architecture. You are architects. So your strength is architecture. But what this gives you is the broadest horizon of issues in Western societies and in post-colonial societies, which are Western societies essentially, over the last 300 years, and what some of the best minds grappling with these issues have made of these issues. And that is the full horizon, hopefully, that we cover by the time we're through here, and so that you at least have a kind of orientation, a compass for your own efforts, so that you don't feel you have to reinvent it all, or you don't feel the weight of the past and it's not understandable to you. You don't feel you don't have clues of support. It's very important to feel that in other endeavors, people have gone through the same things, faced the same problems in other disciplines, etc. And, architecture, I think, is a very central laboratory for all of these issues. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach in architecture schools. Now, tonight, I will try and give you a handle on the issues in Charles Taylor's fantastic lecture called Modernity and the Public Sphere. It's in the Dropbox. Those of you who look for it will find it online all over the place. It's as famous in a way as Habermas's talk that we dealt with last time on modernity, an unfinished project. And it's important to be aware of just how unusual and how unorthodox Taylor's take is on this, his approach to the whole issue of modernity. We who identify ourselves as modern, we who identify ourselves as perhaps religious or tribal, identify ourselves as that against this big criterion called the modern. So the modern features even in its rejection. It determines even the way it is expelled. So it's very important not to have a misconception about the modern, because you're either relying on it to take you somewhere, you're relying on it to provide you with the guarantees that your society offers. It is a modern guarantee to have freedom of the individual. It is a modern guarantee to have rights. It is a modern guarantee to have elections and change your representatives. It's a modern guarantee to be able to pursue economic activities without being constrained by anybody else, like a king taxing you, or pirates, or colonists. And it is a modern guarantee that you can question, and that you can have opinions, and that your opinions have weight. You can get an opinion out there, you all use Facebook, and suddenly you say something and 10 people pounce on you and 10 more people defend you or whatever. And in other words, your freedom of opinion is creating a consequence. And that, in a tiny little bubble, is one of the biggest modern guarantees, the guarantee of a public sphere, of civil society. Any opinion that you have addresses us all. Because you're in a modern society, if you think that rapists should be castrated, and you put that on Facebook, I am able to reference it to an incident in the news 2 weeks ago, a campaign for castrating rapists, a counter-campaign somewhere else where the rapists want to fight back, various surveys and constituencies, etc. Now, how am I able to do that? Why is it not just your opinion whispered in my ear secretly, and I'm nodding my head and saying, yeah, it's a sin, it's a pity? The fact is that we are all, each of us as citizens, able to launch beliefs and concern ourselves with everything. Everything that happens in our society entitles us to reflect, formulate an opinion, engage in a public argument, as we see on Facebook, but in a coffee shop where you're punching each other's lights out over a particular issue. And you say sauerkraut stinks, it should be banned, and saying, I can't live without sauerkraut, etc. And you form constituencies for sauerkraut. And you have gang fights with sauerkraut knives and sauerkraut forks and sauerkraut cans and whole cabbages sometimes. You know, and you dispose of your enemies in a vat of vinegar. Well, what are you doing? You are effectively elaborating a process in the public sphere. You are becoming a good, or being a good, conscious member of civil society, because civil society is made up of opinions, but very special opinions. Opinions addressed to all, that all may concern themselves with. And you may post something on Facebook and someone in Japan picks it up and shoots you down. And they have an absolute right to do this. Now, part of the intrigue of Taylor's article, and you must read it. If you haven't read it, you're big fakers. So you must read all 58 pages of it. It'll go by in a flash, like your lifetime when you're drowning. Part of Taylor's great appeal is that he reminds us of how improbable and how unlikely this feature of modern society is. How civil society, or the public sphere, two names for the same thing, seems to emerge without institutions supporting it, without kings or parliaments or parties or priests or lawmakers or referees or investors structuring it and laying down the rules, without people running around behind the scenes organizing it. It arises in a conversation here, in a coffee shop. Jürgen Habermas is usually the name associated with civil society or public sphere, because in the 1960s he wrote a brilliant doctoral thesis. Take note, those of you about to write PhDs, that's what you have to match. He wrote a brilliant doctoral thesis on the transformations of the public sphere. And some of the most brilliant passages are about the public sphere, public opinion, emerging in coffee shops, appropriately enough, and emerging in coffee shops where people would argue about the latest novel or the latest musical performance or the latest critic's opinion. So people would argue about aesthetic issues, or they'd argue about moral issues, or they would form opinions, fight with each other, come to some kind of resolution, create groups and factions, or create coalitions, or agree with each other. And in such a way build public opinion, so that when somebody says Bach is great, as my colleague Chat said, Bach is great because public opinion was formed around Bach like a coral reef at some point, and has stayed fixated on him. in such a way that it remains great. But remember, at one point Stalin was great, and he created his own public opinion to make him appear great. There are such things as fake or totalitarian or manipulated public spheres, as we had in this country. Big ceremonies and press releases and fake editorials where you're supposed to see what someone thinks, but they are writing what their bosses are telling them to write, and so on and so forth. So the public sphere is something open to manipulation, open to collapse, open to caricature, as in fascist countries or communist countries or apartheid South Africa, but also something which seems to rise up and renew itself, does not require an institutional framework. There's no school where you can go and get a degree in public sphericness. Okay? There is no special competence where you can do courses to brush up on the public sphere. You are part of the public sphere. Every conversation you have, which expresses some view that you hold and which could potentially modify that view as a result of other people's responses, is an element in the public sphere. But because it's in the public sphere, what's public about it is that it is never a conversation between you and your cronies. It is a conversation which, once it's out there, he can respond to, and she can get steamed up about, or she could legitimately shoot down in flames. In other words, there's this amazing thing which is out there. It's informally fueled by conversations in a coffee shop, by opinions, by matters of taste, by moral disagreements, by spite, pettiness between scholars, who knows what. But once that launches into the public sphere, it is able to create a momentum of its own, build up an issue, become the issue. And when it is such an issue, politicians turn around and say, it's a constituency. The public wants X. We daren't do Y or Z. We have to respond to X. Therefore, politics get driven, political parties get elected, the state fuels itself and guarantees its relevance and its legitimacy on the basis of this weird candy floss thing called the public sphere. And yet there's no hard of the soft, there's no skeleton called the public sphere. Where do we track it down to its lair? Some people say that the lair of the public sphere is the media, because after all, the media are very influential in forming public opinion. But the media are actually very much cut down to size in the public sphere. You can say, Weekly Mail says Jacob Zuma slaughters 10,000 virgins at Nkandla. You know, that's a typical Weekly Mail take. You know, so suddenly it's one opinion in the public sphere. So the public sphere has the power to shrink the media. Or if the media try to drill some opinion into you, you turn around and you create public opinion against it. You say, you know, those jerks on SABC2 think we're fools. We're not fools, comes the belief in your part of the public sphere. Let's strike back at them and send old Cuz, what's his name, Barry Hilton, to send them up and do an SABC2 caricature, another event in the public sphere. So you need to understand the public sphere is this extraordinarily flexible thing. It's like humor in totalitarian societies. You cannot chop it off its head, you cannot kill it, you can try and burn it. It comes back, it's like Petrushka. So, but the point that comes through very forcefully in Taylor's argument, and of course Habermas has kind of done the canonical account, the great account of the public sphere in his doctoral thesis. Point that comes through strongly with Taylor is that the public sphere seems to arise and have these very unusual properties of allowing one person to address everybody. And yet, it is not an institution. It's not a broadcast house. It's not a publishing house. It's not the Gutenberg Press and the Bible. It's not the Vatican and its church networks putting out a certain law or value system. It's not the market. There's nothing in it to be in the public sphere. No one's got rich of it. No one's really got poor of it either. but people have got educated and informed of it. And part of being a rational modern human being is being able to conduct yourself in the public sphere, knowing what to do, knowing how to be in public, and knowing how to use, thank you, my angel, knowing how to use the resources of the public sphere. But they have to be used very, very appropriately, because it's like seduction. You can't club your partner over the head and drag them off by the feet, because that's kind of overstating it. And you can't sort of kind of fidget behind your serviette all night and never pop the question, because that's understating it. So there is a kind of judgment and a kind of art of, you would say in French, comportement, a way of behaving, a way of carrying yourself, a way of negotiating the public sphere. But this stance has very little to do with rules of behavior. It's not like good table manners. It's not like legality and behaving in a legal way or not violating someone's rights. It's not quite charisma, but it's a way of making a dent in the public sphere, knowing that you can never control the public sphere, but that you, to be modern, you have to be in it. But that your progress in it depends on everyone else. So one of the authors that Taylor cites, apart from Habermas, is an American who looks at the formation of the Canadian and the American public spheres straight after the American Revolutionary War, which was in 1776 against King George III, mad King George. Fortunately, he was so crazy at the time, he never really felt the loss of the American territories. And then the Americans had to get this problem solved. Who are we? We are former subjects of the British king. We fought a war. We won the war. They were rather like the dog who chases the bus and one day it catches the bus. And now what? So they started to send communications, which Taylor says could have seemed like a practical joke, named Horace or Cicero or some august Roman orator, and addressing all of you. And so things would be published addressing you all. And so this sense of you all, what has to happen such that something concerning our politics or our values or our identity or our being or our regrets or whatever element of belief, of opinion, is sent out there, addressed to you all. See that practical joke. Hey, you all, you think it's an advert. But the fact is, you all means all of us who seem to share a common concern and feel addressed by this thing which says you all. So there have been various very interesting attempts such as that to show how this particular area outside an institution grows up under particular circumstances in which people feel concerned with everything that goes on around them and obliged to have an opinion and obliged to hear the opinions of others as equal and obliged to respond to the opinions of others in a certain mode by reflecting on them and having a rational discussion about it. If I say, damn it, I hate that issue, I refuse to discuss it, and I storm out of here, I've made an exit, a temporary exit from the public realm. I've gone into some private neurotic realm where I've got indulge my hatred of potato chips or whatever it is, you know, that put all the trans fatty acids in my brain and I just rant and I tear out some chip packets. But then I come back and express an opinion. Even if the opinion is, I'm sorry for my outburst, I'm shoehorning my statements and my presence back into the public sphere. I wish to engage again. And you'll say, no, it's okay, we all understand. In other words, there's a public opinion out there that can allow for outbursts against chip packets. And so we resume publicness. Now, what strikes Taylor and what should strike you is that why does everybody suddenly feel concerned and addressed by things, by the opinions of their fellow citizens? Why don't they simply say, I'm only listening to a priest, a doctor, my lawyer, my stockbroker, my mother-in-law, and various relevant authorities? Let's look at those individuals in turn. Your priest can stand up in a pulpit and address you all, because you've all decided to be members of a congregation. You are inside an institution, and that institution gives the priest the right to mediate the truth and to speak the word of a divine law or of a divine truth. And no one turns around and says, but in my opinion, Isaac should have got up, bought a chopper, and cut off, who was trying to do in Isaac? Abraham. Yes. Who was killing Isaac? Abraham. Abraham did everything bad. He was a badass character anyway. But, you've got to say, I think that he should have fought back. The priest says, out. You're beyond the pale of the institution. This is not the public realm. We don't care what you think. You're here to be faithful in your belief. You say, I care what my stockbroker thinks. Absolutely. The laws of the market determine whether my investment is going up and down. And my stockbroker knows a little bit more as an expert, like one of these Habermas guys, about the trends in the stock market. And he may be able to advise me in a way that I might find counterintuitive or, a bridge too fast to listen to an expert. I listen to my doctor. Yes, my doctor knows what's going on inside me better than I do. I listen to my mother-in-law. Well, why do mother-in-laws have such an unhandy authority? I've found my various mother-in-laws quite wise, actually, but I should have cautioned their daughters against me a bit more. But why does your mother-in-law have authority? Because there is an institution that confers authority upon her, a very ancient institution known as the family. And through the mother-in-law, two families are brought together in a certain way, and that gives powers to the mother-in-law. But for the public realm, there is no supporting institution. It has absolutely no institutional support. And the ability to address people relevantly always happens in institutions. You, servants of the king, you, faithful followers of whatever, Hare Krishna. You, investor community in Wall Street. You, bankers. You, good Catholics. You, sports freaks. You, fitness fanatics. You, anorexics. You, bulimics. They all have a kind of institution, even if it's psychiatry. They all have an institution, and in that institution, someone has authority conferred on them by the institution. But in the public realm, the only authority you have is your last performance. I bumped into Adam Habib in the coffee shop today. He's cut his hair, almost unrecognizable. But I went up and I congratulated him on his new appointment as Vice Chancellor of WITS. And I said, you understand it's like herding cats. I said, but I'm sure you're very good at that. So I said, good to see you, good to see you. And he's flipping through his mental Rolodex. Who the hell is this guy? Anyway, there is a guy who puts forward political opinions, and put forward some striking political opinions on Mangoom 2 hours before the announcement of the election, and got it dead wrong. Okay, so he created his own grave in the public realm by means of the public realm. Nobody said, you're a stockbroker who lost money by calling it in favor of Motlanthe. You're fired from Lehman Brothers. Nobody fired him. But his stocks in the public realm went down because he got it wrong. He surfed a wave and didn't shoot the curl and tumbled under and never emerged. But, anybody could do that. So the public realm is not administered, it is not institutional, it is not structured. Now, here comes the interesting part. For Taylor, the public realm, in spite of its great intrinsic fascination and importance to all of us, because it is truly a democratically accessible, you all have access to it, equal to anyone else's, in whatever your credential is. You don't need a qualification to get there. You just need to go there and to start operating there and to start reacting to others there. And it has the power to pull down governments. If we look at the events in Eastern Europe, those protests which brought down governments, or in Egypt today, are simply expressions of public opinion. They're not elections, and they're not revolutionary wars. A war is highly institutionalized. They are simply people saying we are prepared to stand behind public opinion and even take a bullet rather than step down from our opinion. We are here to get martyred for civil society, for the public sphere. That's what the culture of protest means. Many people are perplexed by the work, very popular work of Hart and Negri, Antonio Negri. Who's read Empire? Hart and Negri. Who are the trendy folks here? Who are the kind of guys who wear a bandana, expensive one, and smash a McDonald's window somewhere in Toronto during a G7 conference? You could be a candidate. To be perfectly honest, yeah, I must single you out. But people are puzzled by Hart and Negri's book, which tries to look at the kind of the left. Where is the left today? Where is the left today? The revolutionary masses, the people who transformed China, the people who took over Russia in 1917, where is the left? Who made Paris ungovernable in 1968? Negri and Hart, who are two kind of, I suppose, post-Marxist Marxists, put forward the view that protest, rather than a strategy or a seizure of state power, whatever, protest has become an end in itself. It has become the great instrument of the left. Leftist politics focuses and expends itself on protest. And you're surprised to see, like Francis of Assisi and various saints and martyrs next to Marx and Lenin and Bertolt Brecht and the usual heroes of the left in the pages of Negri and Hart. And in an interesting way, you could say, well, that's rather flat-footed, because you protest, you get hit in the head, you take home trophies, you upturn a dustbin, you throw a tomato at a cop, and that's it. You get the photos, all over Facebook and Twitter. You're on your good profile, and that's it. It's easy to be cynical about it. But in fact, the fact that protest has become a preferred modality of the left in Western countries and many countries tells us that in those countries, the public sphere has tremendous prestige and authority and can make or break governments, regimes, military juntas, as we've seen in Egypt, or almost in Tiananmen Square. So protest is in fact a way of making the public sphere stick in societies where the public sphere is under pressure, where freedom of belief and freedom of opinion is under pressure. Protest is like putting a warrant. The public sphere is casino chips. This is taking out a gold bar and saying, this, my life, I put it on the line for the right to express this opinion publicly, and more importantly, to maintain publicness. Why don't people just sit at home in Egypt and Twitter one another and say, tut, 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 things are bad. I totally agree with you, comrade. Love, hashtag, prison sentence. Okay? Why go out and risk a bullet simply to create publicness? Because what's the point of hashtagging your way around? You are there to create publicness. You are saying to that regime, you cannot kill publicness, you cannot kill the public sphere. No particular content in the public sphere. We value the public sphere as I nearly said institution, but it's not an institution. We value it as one of our essential defining characteristics as modern people, and we value it as one of our essential rights, even though it's not structured by rights or by law, or upheld by the state. If anything, it upholds the state and law. So we have a very strange animal, where even the radical left converge, without saying as much, on the idea of protest as an extreme warrant on the validity of publicness and public opinion and the public sphere. So, what's in it for Taylor, you might ask? Taylor's argument is really very extraordinary, but it is subtle. If it were a building, this is not a Liebeskind building, where it pokes you in the eye, knocks you over the head, and then tries to seduce you. This is more like, who's really subtle out there? No one's subtle in the 20th century. Who's really subtle? It's like one of those kind of slightly unexpected Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, you know? It's a very incredible integrity and detail, but once you put it all together, it has tremendous power as an argument. Because what is Taylor arguing by means of the public sphere? Why is it important? He says it has no factual foundation, it has no institutional foundation, it has no rules, it has no competences. You can't go to school to become a good participant in it. Or you can't break rules and say, I'm going to break the rules and get expelled. You can't break the rules and say, I'm out of here. It is this extraordinary thing. It is almost like an image of freedom itself. So the assumption, even when I'm trying to oppress you with some kind of strong regime or some kind of campaign, the assumption is that you're free and that I'm oppressing a free person. I can't brainwash you. I have to, in a way, mislead your freedom or separate you from your freedom. The modern assumption is that you're all free. But where are you all free? You're really not free in any institution, because in an institution you have rules laid down to you which are part of your observance in that institution if you wish to benefit from that institution. If you're on Wall Street, you can't be a rogue trader. If you are a baseball pro, you can't abide by the rules of football when the whim takes you. So institutions are a give and take, they're a trade-off. But the public sphere is absolutely free, and in fact your freedom is a condition of participation in it. Because if I take Nati and I tie him up and put a gun to his head, and I tell him he's a man who writes some fantastic editorials on Facebook, I put a gun to his head and I say, you're going to say such and such on Facebook, and he says it, okay? I have in a way completely falsified the thing. I can't sustain that position, you know, because sooner or later it's going to come out that I've got him tied up, I've got him in a basement somewhere, and force him to write all that stuff, the way in which communist regimes or fascist regimes had their newspaper editors, their propagandists, their whatever, tied up. And even in that situation, let me cite one example that I find very striking, and you may know this example. Hitler's favorite filmmaker was Leni Riefenstahl. Who has seen the work of Leni Riefenstahl? Triumph of the Will. She was the greatest Nazi propagandist ever. When you think of Nazis as goose-stepping formations, walking in these mass parades with flames and searchlights and uniforms and Hitler in the front on a podium with a big eagle, those are images created. That is the aesthetic, if you like, of Leni Riefenstahl. It's like Tarantino, a guy with drool and blood beaten out of his head saying something to seem cool. That's Tarantino trademark. Well, the image you have of Nazis is in a way the cinematic distillation, the aesthetic distillation of Hitler and the Nazis by a highly sympathetic Nazi, Leni Riefenstahl. She was probably the most evil propagandist ever, for one of the most evil regimes ever, and one of the greatest filmmakers. Why do I say that? She dealt with a completely deformed or suppressed public realm, an ersatz, a fake public realm. But she created these, documented these ceremonies that created a fake ideal public where there was no freedom of opinion, but it was like a utopian publicness. But nevertheless, in the aesthetic dimension, she nevertheless retained an element of freedom. Even though she spewed out Nazi propaganda, she took it in and transformed it in her own way. Not rebellious freedom, but nevertheless freedom. If you look at Riefenstahl's message and her aesthetic, she is freely embracing it. She is still a fruit or a product of the public realm. That freedom is indestructible. The institution of the public realm can be distorted. It can be suppressed. It can be penalized. It can be banned, as in this country. But it cannot be eliminated, because all we have to do is get together by candlelight and talk about the situation in the regime. And there's our starter kit for the public realm. It's based on conversations in places like this. And you hope that she's not a spy and going to report you to Hitler. And she's hoping the same thing too. So basically, publicness for Taylor is a striking, anomalous fact of our society. It's unique in being uninstitutional. It's unique in that no one really brought it about. It's unique in that many of the defining characteristics of the modern individual, freedom of opinion, freedom of action, freedom of allegiance and belief, are exercised, are preconditions for being in the public realm and exercising its powers and participating in it. It brings down governments, and governments try to court it. They try to court public opinion. And yet it cannot be created by governments or political campaigns. It is not a political fact. The public realm is not a political realm. It's closer, if anything, to an aesthetic logic, the way we spelt out the aesthetic logic last time. This rather slippery, open-ended thing of the aesthetic with Habermas. Now, why is this a big deal for Taylor's argument? Taylor wants to argue something very striking. He wants to argue against all those people who include Habermas and many of the greatest thinkers in the West, Max Weber, Karl Marx, Hegel. You want any bigger ones? John Rawls, John Stuart Mill, the whole tradition of liberal democracy, the whole tradition of natural law, the entire system of libertarian individualism, all these heavy hitters who you don't want to tangle with, be stuck in a lift with particularly. He simply undermines the logic of their position because he says their view of the modern is fundamentally flawed. And by decapitating the opinion or the belief of such an influential bunch of people, you know, you would spend 10 years and several PhDs trying to refute Hegel's view of civil society. You'd find it incredibly subtle and slippery, and you'd still come out on top somehow, right? Now here comes Taylor, author of a magnificent book on Hegel, by the way, this thick, one of the great modern exponents of Hegel, who comes along and says not only Hegel, but his disciple Marx, Max Weber, the whole of modern sociology, the whole of modern jurisprudence, modern liberal individualism, everything, has got it wrong. About what? Got it wrong about itself. But I tell you, you're wrong about yourself. You're not who you think you are. It doesn't hang together the way you think it does. It's not going to pan out the way you expect it, and you're not coming from where you think you came from. You'd say that's quite an outrageous claim. How can he know so much about me? And I say, it's not just you, but you got it wrong too, and you, and you, and you. In fact, Taylor is saying in this modest-sized article, if you look at the size of the claim, it's a thumbnail sketch. He is saying that the entire thought world of modernity has got modernity wrong. It's got itself wrong. Habermas pointed out that within the logic of modernization, there are certain unintended consequences. You'll recall there is this divorce between the increasing technicality of the natural sciences and ends means reasoning, and technology being the narrow funnel that filters it into the wider society. And here, the aesthetic becoming specialized and very technical and almost esoteric in the hands of the avant-garde. And even more so in the hands of the anti-avant-gardes who try and make art and life hang together like the Dadaists or the Surrealists. It becomes an even more esoteric matter. So you have these very strange tangles. And here, of course, politics creates this highly novel and synthetic and unusual and for many people mysterious institution called the state. This big automaton, this monster out there is supposed to represent you transparently, represent you. So there's very odd things here. So he's saying that modernity, which was supposed to be about complete reasonableness and transparency and everything being illuminated by one light, the Enlightenment is this light that shines onto everything and suddenly chases away the fog and the shadows and the mysticism and the mysteriousness and the oddness, and suddenly we've switched on the lights. There are no ghosts in here. The place is perfectly clear. Oh, it's you, it's a chair, it's a table. I get it. That's what it is. There are the facts. This enlightenment, in fact, sets up very intensified processes of enlightenment. We want to be enlightened about nature, we want to be enlightened about art and taste, we want to be enlightened about public life and politics. And yet these things create such a ball of wool, such a tangle, that they become out of control, produce irrational consequences such as Stalin and Hitler, create sudden collapses of the aesthetic or the artistic or the ethical, and send us into esoteric arguments between Richard Dawkins and some pro-creationist, which, if it was resolved one way or another, wouldn't make an iota difference to any of us. So the modern has some unintended consequences. So it is flawed in Habermas's construal of it, because the very process of enlightening creates consequences which are consequences of further enlightening, and they end up very disenlightening. They end up doing the opposite, that reason has in fact turned into its opposite. It's an instrument which is in fact turned against itself, not intentionally, but by actually carrying out its program. It's a rather tragic situation. By doing the best it can with the best will and the best powers in the world, it's created an odd society divided between specializations with no transversal connection and a Lebenswelt which has to fall back on tradition to orientate itself. Nothing could be a more pre-enlightenment output than saying the world in which we live is unilluminated. So, that's Habermas's argument, but he's making that argument within an assumption about the validity of the modernist distinctions. He's saying, I'm using a modernist logic to point out that modernist logic went wrong. Just as I can use logic to point out a logical error in your logical process. But he is within modernism. What's interesting about Taylor is that he attempts to pick himself up by the shoelaces, pull himself out of modernism, use none of the assumptions of modernism, but tell the moderns that they are fundamentally wrong about themselves, that their self-conception is absolutely flawed. And then he proposes an alternative account of modernity. We who think of ourselves as modern got that way because we essentially hot-rodded and tweaked a bunch of traditions, a constellation of traditions. We tweaked them and twisted them like plasticine. You start with who sees Gromit and Wallace and these guys or whatever, stop motion animation, which we'll probably have here when Ingmar's card runs out. We'll have the stop motion version, everything jumping. A ball of plasticine, I want a big smile, etc. Taylor's point is that somehow all the elements of tradition, the kind of things which we regard as pre-modern, pre-enlightened, superstitious, irrational, metaphysical, theological, theocratic, bad, untenable, that very plasticine got turned until the features of the modern appeared on its face. It's the same substance. And tomorrow, a clever enough animator can turn it back. So he's saying that the modern is not a break with anything in the past. The modern is a result of a certain manipulation of the elements of tradition. And in fact, the modern is simply a culture. A culture no different to any other culture. When we say, Jacob Zuma, it's cultural, the 6 wives things. Why don't we have 6 wives? It's not rational. Or maybe to your accountant it's not rational. Although from a tax point of view, it's there. When we use culture, we tend to use culture, we moderns tend to use culture in an automatically pejorative way. We say that is a merely cultural decision. It means you're doing something quirky and idiosyncratic, which if you were a Westerner, I'd call you neurotic, or a bit crazy, or a bit half-baked. But because you're not a Westerner, it's cultural. So let's be polite, but let's all understand ourselves as moderns. These cultural folk are really grappling with a burden of ignorance. They're really, they just don't get the picture, do they? And I can't wait for them to modernize, right? I can't wait for them to modernize, to get to where the rest of us are. My sweetheart. I can't wait for them to modernize. At least he's the only one sleeping. Because when they modernize, here we are individuals. We wake up and we found out we were born and we found ourselves individuals. And we're surrounded by what? A world of facts. And objectivity is the way we relate to facts. When we open our eyes, we have no reason for thinking that some devil's deceiving us, or that we need a cleansing or purification or whatever to see reality the right way. We open our eyes and bang, there it is. We moderns are objective. The mode in which we experience is objective. And cascading away here, all the way back to the primal slime, and Fred Flintstone, our cultures. Various degrees of ideology, various degrees of belief system, various degrees of religion, various degrees of metaphysics when it comes to matters of knowledge, various degrees of tradition when it comes to art, of cliche and unoriginality and etc. All these things are like sediments. And we're saying, Brazil, good show, they're modernizing. They're showing good fundamentals. They're trying to get to where the rest of us are. Too bad they have that kind of voodoo and they're so into candomblé and those funny sort of bikini cuts and idiosyncratic things. But you know what? It's their culture. So let's not bother too much about it. But hey, they're the biggest buyers of perfume in the world today. So that's kind of getting there, and maybe they'll get to Chanel and Dior one of these days and stop wanting these fruity perfumes. The perfumers complain that the Brazilians want every aroma to be like fruit. Okay? And that's what? Cultural. Bad thing. If you're objective, you don't want all fruit. You want a nice aesthetic balance between fruit and vegetables. So, you get the picture. We have a unique vantage point here, right? And everybody else is arranged in increasing degrees of distance, and let's put it frankly, stupidity and benightedness and unenlightedness and whatever. If occasionally one of these cavemen or women pops up here amongst us, as in the case of our esteemed president in the views of the English liberal press, he's either a madman, Helen Ziller's personal opinion, or so he's either a case for psychiatry, or if I had my way, I'd send him to a re-education center and civilize him, right? Preferably one in England where they do a lot of civilizing, especially after the rebellion in Lucknow. Or I need to get him to a good psychoanalyst so that he can give up these quaint beliefs. Or I need to put him in a bubble called the museum where we tolerate other ways. We call ourselves a tolerant liberal democracy. We can tolerate old Jake, but the trouble is he's steering the nation. Oh my God. I forgot he's flying the plane. Let's not tolerate him too much, right? You get it. I mean, you've lived this experience where in fact our president, who unified the ANC through several potential disastrous splits, has got an emotional intelligence 1,000 times more than we could possibly put together in this room, is an incredible mover and shaker and has never forgotten what he is, maybe one of the most authentic politicians ever, features in this realm as a dolt, as a cross between Andy Capp, Hugh Hefner, and Barney Rubble. Right? And we're proud of it because we say we're just being objective about the guy. Objectively, would you want your daughter to date him? Hell yes. Says Ivan Porte, hell yes, don't date him. Hell no. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that this individualist, factual, objective, neutral spot here that we call the enlightened modern person is a fantastically, thoroughly ethnocentric bigot. They are the greatest bigot in the world because they're saying everything that's not like me is less than me. And everything that's not like me has one future, to become like me. Whether it's economic development, when they reach here, they'll see how childish this all was. We enlightened ourselves sometime in the 18th century. We arrived, colonized the world, went on a civilizing mission, which is what the British called their colonial adventure, called ourselves civilized, called everyone else uncivilized, and set up this hierarchy. And now these developing countries who are emerging economies or whatever, emerging from what? Emerging from Flintstoneville. Emerging into what? Into the Enlightenment. So do you understand how important the notion of modern is to us. We use it constantly, continuously. It is our absolute hallmark. And yet, Taylor is arguing that it's in fact merely the expression of a tribe. That the justification, the foundation of modern, is simply a particular tribe that hot-rodded a certain number of traditions, mainly sovereign, feudal sovereignty politically, and Christianity, hot-rodded them in certain ways, and then one day said, hey, we're rid of them. But they're not rid of them. They're in fact are them. They have become them. We have taken feudal sovereignty forward in the form of what? We no longer believe that the king is the most individual person in society. We believe that every individual is a king. We have taken Christian doctrine forward into our idea of rights and justice and equality. We have simply transformed a number of traditional legacies, which when we actually look at them in their undiluted form, belong down here. With Haitian voodoo and pufferfish magic, or Ghanaian schnapps rituals. I say, don't go to Ghana without your schnapps, I won't do business with you. And we view these things in the same disparaging light, or we view them in an honorary light. We put it in the museum and we call it what? Our history, the long road leading to me. Right. Now this is everything that Taylor demolishes in these 58 marvelous pages. Because he shows that the public realm, which is one of the most distinguishing characteristics of modern society, is in fact completely incompatible with the ontology of modernist society. In other words, what modernist society believes there is. What exists is ontology is the fancy term for the study of what a certain group of people believe exists. So in a society that believes in spirits, spirits would form a distinct realm of that culture's ontology. In the West, we believe two kinds of things exist: conscious experience and nature. So in our ontology, we've got the individual who is surrounded by facts, who learns a lot of facts about him or herself from the human sciences, or from doing questionnaires in Huisgenoot, and then conducts their life accordingly, and wishes they could find a psychiatrist who'd wire them up to one of those crazy Frankenstein machines, so they could actually look at their own thought processes and say, do I want to marry Fifi? Zzz, yes. Objectively, my brain wants Fifi. I must go along with it. It's a fact. I'm more and more objective about Fifi every day. Okay? I mean, that's a caricature, but the fact is, there's very little you can do with an ontology that is rigorously structured into a kind of consciousness which forms the foundation of facts, and nature which forms a kind of big storehouse of facts. And we see ourselves as part of nature, and we treat ourselves as part of nature when we, look for self-knowledge. The kind of self-knowledge we look for is no different in kind to the kind of self-knowledge we look for, the kind of knowledge we look for about trees or about, some kind of crop disease. We believe that it's a natural process that makes us what we are. And Richard Dawkins tells us we evolved out of other natural processes, and so on and so forth. And so we have this utopia of an integral naturalism with a little sovereign, little king, little consciousness somehow sitting in it, whose duty is to be objective and to be factual towards itself and to be factual towards the world. Very boring, isn't it? But Taylor argues in this piece that such a person, or several such persons, could never be the ingredients or the elements or the participants or the foundations of the public realm. Because the public realm is not about facts. It's about an orientation towards other people and an interaction with other people that is purely about opinion. The minute you try and bring facts into the public realm, then you are as stupid as those people who want to create survey questionnaires to understand what political opinion is. Exit polls, stats and whatever, etc. Political opinion is your reason why you would vote for so-and-so and not vote for someone else, or your reason why you'd happily strangle so-and-so and happily applaud someone else, because that is your motivation. A fact cannot motivate you, a value can. So the public realm is there to transact values, right? But where in this world are values? It's a world made up of values. But we all know a world is made up of facts, and values are supposed to be in subjectivity. But how are these values arrived at? They're arrived at in a conversation between people. So somehow they're like ghosts. So the ontology of modernity, the way modernity sees itself as made up and structured and relating to itself, cannot sustain a process like the public realm. And yet the public realm is one of the foundational characteristics of modernity. So there is an implicit collision between modernist ontology, which says one day we woke up and we stopped having those terrible nightmares, believe in God, reverence for our elders, for our ancestors, authority of tradition, doing things the way people have done it before, having a respect for the dead and for their sacrifices and what they have given us, and we stand on their shoulders. And one day we woke up and all that stuff was gone. And we decided, I'm going to freely make up who I am, what I want to do, and I'm going to get on with it. And I'm going to find the institutions that will allow me to do that, say the market or rights. And there I go, a herd of loners, a herd of cats. However, for Taylor, something comes long before that, and that is the notion of publicness. And the individual is just some kind of bubble that pops out of publicness. It's a derived notion from publicness. It's not a more primary notion. The individual is not the atom of the public realm. The public realm is the more atomic, more elemental notion. The individual is, as it were, a reflection, a certain kind of spin-off of the public realm. And the individual comes from the idea of privacy. And privacy comes from the idea of the relationship in Protestantism to God and to the Word of God. So religious institution created privacy, and privacy created shared privacy, or public opinion, which has its roots in personal private opinion. And if it doesn't, it's not authentic. So we have a very strange metamorphosis, and I leave it to you to trace these various subtle and very beautiful arguments in Taylor, where he shows that in fact tradition directly informs the public realm. The public realm is supposed to be a product of the modern ontology, but the modern ontology is traditional through and through. It is absolutely traditional, and even the ways in which it rebels against tradition are informed by tradition. So there is a religious constellation, a social constellation. It's not that an idea got into people's heads and they started to say, I want to act on this idea and have a different world according to this idea. Because their training, their ability, their powers to act on this thing would have to come from somewhere. All ideas we have are simply an expression of something, a basic constellation, a basic composition, a basic form of life hung together by tradition. And therefore it is never far from tradition. And our thought about our situation is cut off from our history, lives in an island populated by rather fantastical notions. But in fact is an island kept afloat by tradition, which it constantly has to falsify and metamorphose. And if we had to do its genealogy and confront it with its own tradition, the way Taylor does, and to show that this can never be the foundation for itself, it creates considerable mayhem. In other words, the modern cannot think itself. Okay, I have provided you with a rough sketch, I guess, of the issues in the Taylor article, or at least the first 3/4 of the Taylor article, and an indication, I hope, of why they are important and how they form instruments for ourselves who identify as modern, or who identify as traditional, or identify as theistic or metaphysical, only under a number of severe restrictions and qualifiers and ifs and buts within the regime of the modern. He provides us with essential resources to understand who we are, and outlines why the resources we habitually use, our modernist ontology of individuals and facts, is inadequate to accounting for its own origin. Its origin is in a reconfigured constellation of elements drawn from tradition and very ingrained human capacities and practices refined by tradition, which are then rearranged like bits in a kaleidoscope into the modern. Then it is that very process that we were unable to think. And these bits didn't come to the doorstep of the modern and then say, all right, take over my son, I'm retiring and I'm going to die. They continue to be the elements of modernity. Tradition is, in its reconfigured form, the very substance of modernity. And it is the relationships between the elements of tradition which themselves make modernity unable to think itself. They are folded in such a way, if you can imagine, one of those things that I hope you, being topologically inclined as architects, played with in your adolescence, and that is a Mobius strip. I'm sure you're all familiar with a Mobius strip and how to make one to entertain your kids. An ordinary sheet of paper, one twist in it, and then you tape it together and you invite them to draw a line. And they carry on drawing the line. Except the line never ends. You find yourself going round double because you have two surfaces which have been twisted into one. So if you think about modernity having twisted tradition, the constellation or the elements, if you like, constellation is usually stars. These stars are unrelated. Some might be very far away, some might be dead or extinct, etc. And a constellation usually puts them together into some kind of shape. In this case, red hiney from cow and chicken, the constellation of red hiney. But the elements of a constellation can then, the same stars, can migrate into different places and another outline happens. But the point is that the elements of a constellation are not the same. Yet within modernism or modernity, the elements of our social and personal constellation and even our natural constellation tend to be very much the same. As you saw in the Habermas example, where the same method of reason can rationalize nature, can rationalize the aesthetic experience and the subjective experience, and can rationalize the social and political experience. So they are very much the same in our conception. But if we think of this constellation as a Mobius strip, as something which has somehow managed to twist itself, to make its historical reality unthinkable to us, who are part of that historical reality, who are heirs of that reality. But we tend to think of ourselves as something else. We tend to think of ourselves as visitors from Mars, fallen into nature with a consciousness that was born yesterday. So, with that very striking argument in mind, let us look at what's in that same Taylor article for us as architects, as people who are obliged to concern ourselves professionally and be responsible for and responsive to space. One of the most striking images in Taylor's characterization of the public realm is a spatial one. He calls it a metatopia. He says it defines a metatopic space. Now what is meta? Meta means beyond. Beyond, and topos is place. So a space beyond places. Where were the previous topi, plural topos, topi, where are the previous spaces? They were in churches, in rituals, in the courts of kings and princes, in the cycle of the seasons around agricultural production and farming, in the chivalric journeys of pilgrims and knights and crusaders and so forth. And these spaces were informed by sacredness, by specialness, etc., and they were cut off and separate. And they formed a certain kind of geography of intense and very special topi, or places, with the center of the world being Jerusalem and the rest of the world being flat. Now, when he says we have a metatopic space, what he is saying is that We have some of the qualities of personalization, individualization, interaction, truth, validity, conviction, faith, hope, passion, spread uniformly everywhere and available the moment you two sit down to have a conversation and an argument to justify your opinion or to disqualify his opinion or to agree or disagree in a reflective, reasoned way. The minute we reflect, say, why do I think what I think? Is it possible to have a better life, think in a better way, be a better person, have a better world, etc.? You are in fact latching into, splicing into this metatopic space. It's metatopic because it is beyond any particular topos, even though it has the quality previously reserved in the tradition for the various special topi. Think about Jerusalem, where three world religions converge. The Buddhists and the Hindus just converge on Jerusalem to make it truly ungovernable. Or think about pilgrimage routes, where in fact you walk for miles, for hundreds of miles, in order to be in the presence of the relic of a saint, in order to have a better relationship to somebody who is an exemplary identity or an exemplary human being. These are the various highly structured topi. So it is no small claim to say that the public sphere has all of the qualities that were historically created in these pressure cookers, in these laboratories, these human experiments of these various topi. But that somehow it's managed to generalize these things across all of space. He doesn't say, as the moderns would do, that public space is where two individuals share their opinions, as if the individual is the center of a space. He says that, in fact, public space has allowed the extraordinary qualities of the sacred, of the hell, of the profane, of the most disgusting, of the most perilous, of the most whatever, all the topi that populate the tremendous medieval stories, or the biblical topi, or the scriptural topi in other religions, the sacred places, the centers of the universe, the places of trial and ordeal in the epics, etc. This epic quality of space has somehow become available for all of us to conjure up in the snap of a finger. To conjure up anywhere, to inhabit, to make use of. So the idea of a metatopic space raises the question, since it is not an institution, if tomorrow Hare Krishna or the Moonies won all the world lottos simultaneously, the way Nigerian letters, 419 letters, assure me I win. Every day I win several lotteries. You must understand, I just don't have time to cash them in. But let's just say that two rather outspoken sects were to win all these lotteries for real, and were now to become the world religions, right? And bought places all over the world. That would be an institutionalization, a spread of those beliefs through institutionalization, and indeed the spread of Roman law, the Roman concept of a citizen, the imperium spread through an institutionalization like that over Roman roads to that venerable old Roman town called London and that other venerable old Roman settlement called Paris. So I can well understand how a topos, the topos of Rome with its emperors and its laws and its citizens, could spread along the institution of a road to the institution of a colony. That is an inside institutional spread. We all understand that very well. The Silk Road in China, the whole Arab-African interaction in North and West Africa, etc., defined itself along certain routes in certain towns. But these are institutional, if you like, dissipations or multiplications within an institutional frame. The remarkable thing about the public realm is that it's completely non-institutionalizable, and it is not an institution. and it can't sustain an institution, and institutions can't sustain it. They're like oil and water. Therefore, if the public realm is a metatopic space, it somehow managed to accumulate all of the properties and qualities and potentialities of epic space, of medieval space, of sacred space, and also a lot of perhaps of the pitfalls and disasters and negativities of the tradition. And it's managed to take them and make them available simultaneously in a spatial form everywhere and to everyone. You know, is it a utopian ideal? Well, it is indeed utopian in the literal sense. Utopia means nowhere. It's nowhere and it's everywhere. So there is a fact that is not institutionally based. Therefore, how can one have these potentials, these memories, these powers in space and reconfigure them? We must say that it is an architectural and an urban fact. It is an architectural and an urban power to be custodians of these qualities of space and to reconfigure them. If the public realm is a metatopia, it is a metatopia and available as such because architecture and cities have made it such. It is one of the probably most fundamental themes and one of the most difficult to think themes of architecture. That is why when, as I used to do, I used to teach something in my elective course to fourth years about Habermas and civil society and public space and etc., etc. There's always a strange sense of excitement and recognition and a strong sense of the potential of this discussion, and people get fired up about it. But on the other hand, nobody quite manages to bridge the gap between that and the way you are using space and dealing with space and making space, etc., and thinking about it. Because the minute you think about the space you're in one of the most modernistic, individualistic, Euclidean defined spaces. You're in a space according to GARP, space according to the modern individual. You are in what comes out of the modern individual. Here's the Cartesian consciousness, hooked up to a camera oscura called an eye. Let's put it in a skull for decency. There it is. Let's grid the thing up. And there, according to Brunelleschi, is the baptistry. When you think architecturally, you're in fact here, and you're thinking about that. So it would be very interesting to understand that this high modernist myth of facts structured as representations to a consciousness and originating in the world and so on is the gateway through which you have to think architecture. And so you get very excited about the idea that there's an incredible potentiation of space in the public realm, and you say, I wish I could design the public realm. I wish I could design into the public realm. Some people even make their fifth-year projects. I want a building which can encourage those civil society interactions, etc., etc. And the result is just a progressive disconnect. And you must ask yourself why. Because the tenets, if you like, the mythology, the ontology of architecture is the same as any other ontology of the little modernist bigot up here. The ontological bigot at the apex of these enlightenments. You would have to get out of this, and later on we'll see how both Sloterdijk and Latour give us tools for getting out of this without confusing ourselves fatally. You'd have to get out of this in order to think into that metatopic space and work with that metatopic space and have the confidence to intuit in that metatopic space and pull it out of the air. Now, why do I put this big demand on you? You are young, you are beginners as designers and creators and shapers and perverters and unperverters of space. Why do I put this huge demand on you to go forth, abandon 300 years of rationality and go directly into metatopic space and work with it? Because you're already there. When you're on Facebook and when you're fighting with your buddies, you're in fully functioning body and soul, hormones and Gucci skinny jeans in metatopic space. It's the public realm. You already understand that space. You're already there. Unfortunately, as Taylor says, the tools given to think it are so perverse, are so Mobius strip-like, are so arcane, and also so poverty-stricken, that even though we're in it, we can't be there. You know those dogs? You've got dogs that have got eczema. Whose dogs had eczema? There's a dog with eczema. Right? Somehow it always seems to happen in the unreachable spots. And then the vet comes along and says, put on this ointment and then install a lampshade. Right? And so your dog bangs into everything because they have permanent tunnel vision. They think they've had a stroke, but they can't turn around and bite where it itches. Well, that is Taylor's article as a dog. Essentially, the terms of modernist ontology, and these are the very terms of architecture as well, don't allow you to actually get to the rest of where you are. The rest of you is functioning perfectly well as a dog, lifting your leg on someone else's opinion, or their battery, or whatever it happens to be, very happily on Facebook, on Twitter. We're throwing, chips at each other in the canteen as a result of your intense participation in the public realm, which no one taught you. And nobody has to coach you in. Now, why can't you reconnect the elements of your expertise to this area, which is almost defined by lack of expertise? The second point that you will find striking towards the end of Taylor's article, and you must understand he's a very laid-back Canadian dude. If you check him out on YouTube, he's like the uncle you always, Kenneth Clark. He's like a kind of uncle you always wished you had, a classy uncle like that. But he's just too classy because, as I was saying to Chats, if this had been a French writer, every second page would have been Nietzsche, Foucault, pouvoir, savoir, etc. If Jean Lyotard were writing this article, it would be like a Christmas tree lighting up. It would be like, the London Olympics. But here's this polite Canadian dude who knows everything there is to know about the traditions of philosophy, who himself is a very staunch Catholic. I mean, he's really incredibly credentialed to do this whole thing, and he's probably the most important modern philosopher, second to Habermas. And he's written these incredible books. Who else would have the chutzpah to write a book called The Sources of the Self? And after that, you've seen the sources of the self, you've looked at the forbidden sources and secret spices. Now, Taylor is an incredibly laid-back guy, and it's to his detriment. Canadians are incredibly polite and even-tempered and whatever, and un-American, I would say. And it works against Taylor because if he had more vulgarity, he would be a household word, because what he's arguing here is very important. So you can miss subtleties in his arguments. I'm stressing some things in a rather vulgar manner myself to help you to lock onto them and jump onto those carriages when they come past you in the article. And the last very fascinating thing for me is what he says about time. He says that modernity and, say the public realm seems to have a very homogeneous idea of time. So for instance, if something happens here, right, Julius Malema with his megaphone addresses the workers in Marikana. Within this simultaneous slice like this, we can then pull in yesterday, which is another simultaneous slice, in which Derek Hanekom reiterated his position on Julius's expulsion. And we can have a conversation about whether they made a mistake to expel Julius, since he's still out there and he seems to have support. And on the other hand, so-and-so is saying, but he's losing ground in the youth league. Okay? And you're saying, but he doesn't really have support. But you say, if those damn TV cameras just stopped paying attention to him, he'd vanish into obscurity. He'd be on the street along with these poor surprised backers. But then you say, no, the media can't make a guy like that. He's got genuine charisma. But you say, but he wasn't speaking to the youth. Where were they? They were in Rosebank Mall. So various issues happen. And what we've mapped here is the formation of an opinion, public opinion. You're part of public opinion. That could, in fact, be culled from elements which are bound together by a homogeneous time. Right? to get some idea of what a non-homogeneous time is like, consider his example. He says, within the Old Testament, the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham is seen to, in some sense, converge upon the crucifixion of Christ in the New Testament. And there is a time in which these things are in fact the same. They converge. All right? Now there is, what we mean by eternity is a kind of time which can be configured in which all kinds of things can converge on one another. But one can't imagine getting a good discussion on Julius Malema going here, because probably this system is very striated. It would have to be highly structured. So Julius would get in there and he'd either be ruling in heaven or he'd be paying for his sins in hell. So in Taylor's example, you have a time in which there is a time outside time that coordinates and integrates that time. The Old Testament, according to Christians, is in fact an allegory or an anticipation of another condition out here, another truth, which in fact makes it interpretable and makes sense of it. So this framework coordinates this time. Whereas we've seen here that public opinion coordinates these slices of time. So his discussion of time is indeed very fascinating. And when you consider that he's saying that the modernist sense of time, and here of course he has to footnote Heidegger, whose masterpiece is all about time and being. Time as the fundamental, the primordial experience of modern being. He says there's a modern conception of time and has a certain structure. But then in keeping with his argument, remember that this conception of time comes out of this epic time, which is the time of the Western tradition up until, say, the 17th century. So in fact, this is simply reconfigured into that. Who has played these games of the cat's cradle, where you have a piece of string and you invite somebody to do this and do that, and you get all these various constellations. But at some point you just do that and it's the same piece of string. Fundamentally, this argument about reconfiguring of time. Now I must ask you if time, according to Heidegger, is one of the most fundamental structuring elements of modern experience, then what is powerful enough to reconfigure time? You know, when people in this constellation thought about a reconfiguration of time, it was called Armageddon. It was called the end of all that is. The apocalypse would be a serious reconfiguration of time. And, you know, if we think about the Hebraic people, they set off into the desert in what is essentially a prophetic time. It is prophesied that they will arrive in the promised land, etc. They set off in a time of prophecy. And then the prophecy doesn't come to fulfillment, and the beliefs get completely reconfigured. And you must imagine their state of mind. We're talking about reconfigurations of time here. You must imagine their state of mind. It's as if you're engaged to the girl and then suddenly you see in the paper she's getting married to Freddie next weekend. Right? So it's very disappointing when the prophecies don't come true. And of course the Hebraic prophecies, or the prophecies of the Old Testament, are quite extravagant. They call for the downfall of this and the downfall of that and the conquest of the nations. And if you see what David's involved in, it's all incredible stuff. It's basically world domination. When that fails to pass, they enter into a messianic time in which they believe these prophecies will be fulfilled, not by things happening in the world, but by things happening to the entire universe, which will completely change its character when the Messiah comes. And then when the messianic time passes, they still cling to these beliefs, which is like you going to the girl's wedding to Freddie and still thinking she's going to leave Freddie and come to you somehow. But the scenario is different because you're not marrying her. Now it's got to be about cheat on Freddie, divorce him, Martians, or whatever, intervene, etc. So now we have to configure messianic time, which is a very different idea of an advent, how you get to the messianic threshold. is very different to how you get to domination of the Middle East, which we've seen is still quite a problem. Little sweetheart. So once Messianic time falls short and doesn't fulfill its promise, it enters into apocalyptic time. And the whole of Christianity lives in an apocalyptic time. It's in a post-Messianic time, and contemporary Judaism lives in apocalyptic time, and indeed tragically experienced a very apocalyptic moment in the 20th century with the camps. So you have metamorphoses of belief, which are expressed as metamorphoses of time. The same story reconstellated through absolute trauma. So you must wonder what could reconstellate. This, what we call our tradition, you know, the Greeks, Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Christian-Hebraic, Judeo-Hebraic, whatever constellations of time, what must have happened in the 17th century to radically reconfigure time, keeping the same elements, but put it into a secular time, in which we don't see an end of time. We see time as an endless succession of moments, and we try and steer events in time, rather than steer time through events, which is how this time works. So you have a very fascinating model, given that the public realm is a particular use, is in a particular relation to time and to space. It's metatopic, and it requires a homogenized time. It could be that the institutions, the frameworks which create our temporality and create our spatiality are the very framework or the conditions that make the public realm possible. And since for Taylor and for Habermas, I guess, the public realm makes everything else possible, from the legitimacy of law to the adequacy and the acceptability of governments, to the viability of the market, to the intactness of the family, to the sanctity of the individual, and so on and so on and so on. The whole thing might be hanging on architecture. As far as time's concerned, I guess myth and music. So, a very interesting article for you to mine, and the takeouts. Modernity is a highly traditional fact that cannot think itself as such. Even that fact about it is the result of a certain configuration of tradition. The public realm is a litmus test for modernity. It is a characteristic institution of modernity, perhaps the characteristic institution of modernity, along with, say, revolution and nationalism as a kind of side runners. It is an integrator. It integrates our experience, the way we regard the family, the market, politics, everything else is modulated or unfolds in the light, in the time and in the space of the public realm. And yet the public realm is through and through configured from a substance which modernity cannot think, but it is modernity's essential structure. And we cannot institutionalize it, because how do we institutionalize time and space? But we can work into this time and space, or try and get some kind of parity with it once we've taken the modernist lampshade off our collective dog head. And the good news is we don't have to go to the center of the earth or to Jerusalem or on a pilgrimage to get it. We're in fact already in it. We're all very accomplished users of the public realm and co-creators of it. So that is really what's in the Taylor piece, and I strongly recommend it to your attention, and I suggest you read it pretty quickly while all these questions or perplexities are fresh in your head. Who has any questions? Observations, thoughts, cries for help, whatever. You can't be dumbfounded. You're the creators of the public realm. This would be like Geppetto having nothing to say about Pinocchio.
So what methods do you think do you recommend in trying to engage with this child?
I think that, coming baby, I think that as architects, I think you need to to know as much as possible about the public realm as you can, and that means reading a lot of Taylor and a lot of Habermas, because in a way their work, the cutting edge of their work, turns around their understanding, their sometimes rather maverick understanding of civil society or the public sphere or whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, it's important to have a suspicion that there are specific, because remember, this didn't happen then. It happened now. So there is something about the now which is different, which is unique. It's not what modernism says is unique about the now. One day we woke up, had no superstition, followed reason, dominated nature, got antibiotics for our trouble, whatever, and sent rockets to the moon, etc., and have to have therapy to maintain our complex, essentially vacant and rootless self. That story must go out the window. But we have to nevertheless say there's something about the present that makes it modern and makes it think of itself in modern terms consistently, even if misthink of itself in these terms. And we have to say perhaps the one thing which is very osmotic, which goes through all these barriers, like Casper the Friendly Ghost, is the public realm. The public realm, because it is so divorced from institution. It's not rule-governed, structured, knowledge-based, anything. It has this rather anarchic character. It seems to permeate all aspects of modernity. And we can say that what are the spatial conditions for a public realm? If you were an urban planner, would the question make sense, or the ambition make sense, to go into a particular situation and say, I'm going to maximize this to be conducive to public realm? Or I'm going to, as you say, I'm going to emancipate industrial land from this particular configuration. Can you rezone such that public realm can you change the codes, it becomes conducive? In other words, at what level do you engage with the fact that the public realm is metatopic and requires a metatopic space? Something must be managing a metatopic space. It wasn't just the friendly creator said, I want to give you ants in the ant farm a change of pace. Boom. Space and time change. If space and time are artifactual in this way, who's the artificer? It's us. Surely, we must take some kind of bearing on space and say either we're inadvertently messing it up because we're operating in it. And just as whatever you do is a gesture in the public realm, so whatever you do is a gesture in metatopic space. So we should become as aware of the fragility or the potentials of metatopic space as we become of the potentials of nature when we look at the environmental crisis. We say somehow we have to manage nature. Compared to that, the proletarian revolution, we have to just manage the means of production and the state, that's tiddlywinks. You as a generation will have to manage nature. What a story. But you become aware of the fact that you need to do it. Now, in the same way as before the ecological crisis, the 20th century had its, as it were, public space crises. They were called communism and fascism. And in this country, monoracial supremacism, apartheid regime, whatever you want to call it. These were major crises of public space. The recovery from these things is like the recovery from an ecological spill or tackling global warming. But we conceive of nature according to various interesting models. We don't yet have the Gaia. The Gaia model of the Earth as a self-correcting system. Who's read Lovelock? What does this Nicholas guy teach you then? We don't have the Gaia model. Gaia allowed people to think about the ecological issue in a less fragmented way and through a, let's call it a benign personification. Here we had a benign personification. We called it God. But where is the Gaia of public space? We seem to react against the toxins of public space. We react against apartheid and its remnants, colonialism, its remnants. Colonialism is just ultramodernism on a global scale. But we don't really have that handle on it. And the same is true of time, because you'll find that without a particular temporality in this thing, the space doesn't come up, it doesn't make sense. Everything would have its space-time coordinates in a modern framework. Maybe we need to jump through that, beyond that, have some other group view of the object. I don't know. Latour provides us with hints, and Sloterdijk provides us with a new, what he calls a spherology, understanding of spaces. But, so where you have to go is, one, realize that you like the Hubble telescope. Before they went up and fixed it, everything you're seeing is wrong. But with the right distorted lens, you can maybe see everything immediately as tradition. And realize you're dealing with the materials of tradition, you're not dealing with the enlightened materials of a new world. That is why I often say to your elders, if not betters, at these universities, that particularly the Afrikaans language universities did something quite extraordinary in a colonial context, because they indigenized, albeit they indigenized on behalf of a handful of people. But nevertheless, one must admire the process was genuine. And to say we're going to create institutions which are post-colonial and which reflect the situation we are in here now. And in a sense, they had to see through a colonial illusion to get there. And I think that the English medium universities are so far into the colonial illusion that they're constantly having to stoke it up. It's like the Wunga or the cut of the white liberal intellectual. They're constantly having to get rooked up on colonialism in one way or another, whether it's Monty Python or whatever. But the Afrikaans universities, in fact, said we're going into an unknown situation, but it is here. So they, in a way, disencumbered themselves of a certain modernist framework and set about a project that I wish they would resume. There is something in the Afrikaner Republican ideal that has got a strong requirement of indigenization, and contains the elements of a post-colonial resource. And I think even that, if you say that is your immediate piece of history and tradition that you want to grasp and appropriate and understand the modernity of the present, because this country came out with big modernity in 1961. So we have a fairly recent Aufklärung, a fairly recent enlightenment here. You're very lucky. If you were sitting in France to study the Enlightenment, you've got to dig back to 1789 and read Voltaire and do mental gymnastics to say, how the hell did they think that way? And why did the Marquis de Sade get his rocks off and all that? It's inconceivable. How boring. You've got to almost like turn yourself inside out in order to get to the element. But in order to get to the modernist moment in this country's history, you've just got to go to 1961. And Hendrik Verwoerd's Good Neighbors speech. Hendrik Verwoerd is the Voltaire, the Rousseau, the Immanuel Kant, and the Herder of South Africa. You've just got to see modernism as a moment and not a twist in the cat's cradle that can happen anywhere and will happen in different places in the world, not according to the Western model, but according to what the tradition is that came to that point. The modernist twist, there are as many modernist twists as there are traditions. Singapore will have its own. Dubai, no doubt, or Qatar will have its own. Certainly, Czechoslovakia's modernism is not the modernism of California. But if we understand it in these terms, we are not saying modernism or enlightenment is most like us being the heirs of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the North Atlantic EU type Entzauberungs, okay? Disenchantments of reality, detraditionalizings of society, and so on. And Taylor goes into this very well. So you are very lucky because you actually have got a grandpa who's probably out there rooting for old Hendrik and can tell you what was good about him. And you have to be open-minded about this, because there's no good and bad. And evil is just a rejected good for someone. It's just a good that we don't use as a good lately. You need to specialize in what was pre-61, even in your institutions, in the architects, in whatever you're dealing with. And then look at 61 as this modernist moment in these terms and say, how did it come about? And that's what you inherit. You're not inheriting 1789. You're inheriting 1961. That is your modernity. And you're the only guys and girls to have had a modernity. The rest just had the empire, which, as we know, was never really modern. So yeah, well, having preached my sermon on indigeneity, which I think is your legacy. You've come through universities that pioneered indigeneity. You came through post-colonial universities that didn't know it. You need to push through the project of indigenization. You need to take this modernist point and you need to know where it is coming from and what its elements really are. And you're in a position to design the future in a very strong way. Imagine if architecture were fundamental to the public realm. Imagine. That's a big stake to play for. Therefore, go and learn everything you can about Habermas and Charles Taylor. Great, well, thank you very much for your attention and your patience. I'll see you on Tuesday. On Tuesday, we are going to look at Richard Rorty. We're going to look at pragmatism and constructivism as tools for moving around this space. So I will post to Carla which of the Rorty readings. There are 2 or 3 fairly short essays I'd like you to read before Tuesday. Great, thank you very much.